director of the Hannah Arendt Center here. This is a real pleasure for me as the center has grown over the last couple of years. One of the great fringe benefits for the center and for BARD has been that in addition to our postdoctoral fellows, we've been lucky to have people who are working in and around Hannah Arendt's work from around the world come and want to spend time at the center, do their research here at Hannah Arendt's library, attend center events, and also give talks. And this year we have a number of professors. We have a professor from Denmark, and then we have today Kieran who's here from Canada. Kieran has been an active participant in all of our activities all semester, and I really want to thank him especially for that. I think a number of the students have gotten to know him in the seminar, and he's been a great interlocutor to have around for the semester, so it's been a real privilege to have him here. Professionally, he's a professor of sociology, which is interesting enough in itself because there is a certain sense of a distrust between people who study someone like Hannah Arendt and sociologists. And so when someone like Kieran first writes me and says, I'm interested in coming, I'm a professor of sociology, I'm like, aha, very interesting. But as I got to know him, I learned that he was a professor of phenomenological sociology, which makes him much more, fit much better into the Hannah Arendt world. And it's been very interesting for me to see and think how he thinks about things. He's also the chair of the sociology department and legal studies, and director of the Human Sciences minor at St. Jerome's University in the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's been involved in many international research projects, some of which he leads. So he was the co-investigator in a project called The Culture of Cities, Montreal, Toronto, Berlin, Dublin. He's nothing if not cosmopolitan. And he also is currently the co-investigator on the interdisciplinary research project City Life and Well-Being, the Gray Zone of Health and Illness. Again, very interested in cities and their different projects. Today he's going to talk about Hannah Arendt and social science, the question of how one can both be a thinker and a philosopher and also be a social scientist. So without further ado, please welcome Kieran
I'm going to, for the most part, read this. Is it okay if I sit down?
Of course.
I have, as my students have pointed out in my course evaluations, an annoying habit of seeing and a lot. In fact, our children were visiting us, our adult children were visiting us, and we took them to a cafe we like on 110th Street, just outside of Central Park, called Amrita's. And my daughter thought it was Rita's, and just because I say so often, every time I said Amrita's, she said, oh, he's going to Rita's. And I said, no, Amrita's, yeah, Rita's. So one of the ways I discipline myself in terms of my ams and my ahs, is to read. Hannah Arendt did say that thinking is a kind of an interruption. And unfortunately, it's not pleasant when you hear somebody talking and a thought occurs to them, and they say and a lot as they try to collect themselves for the next sentence. So, overall, this paper is about Arendt and the social sciences, and I'm going to use it as a case study, the concept of role that is central to social science understanding of society, and one that's actually has seeped into everyday language. It's one that people use all the time in describing their professional relation to their jobs. What my role is, teacher, student, etc. And there's a sociologist called Anthony Giddens, famous sociologist, who introduced the term reflexive modernity, and he talks about how particularly social science knowledge, but all knowledge seeps down to people who then take it up, and therefore it changes their activity because they're taking up ideas that was a result of studies of what people were doing. And now they take the ideas, and on the basis of those ideas, change their actions, which in turn leads to further studies. So one of those areas is reflexive modernity, is the concept of role. So I just want to begin. The overall paper is to take up a central idea of Max Weber's called the iron cage of modern rationality. How the rise of modern rationality has contributed to the dramatic increase in regulatory mechanisms of modern society, leading to the simultaneous individualization and totalization of modern power structures. This is a theme in Arendt's work, in Foucault's work, Habermas's work, George Grant's work. And all of these theorists, in different ways, have argued that the social sciences are unreflectively embedded in and promoters of this normalizing and totalizing tendency. Now, social scientists do respond to this and say, well, that the attempt to go beyond a narrow empiricist disciplinary study does not make irrelevant the latter's emphasis on testing one's ideas against the evidence. We do empirical research. We test our ideas against evidence and not build theories that are very difficult to test. So, how do we resolve this tension? On the one hand, a significant group of contemporary social theorists who argue that there's a dangerous tendency in modern society, a kind of an increasing in the regulatory mechanisms, the iron cage of rationality. And on the other hand, the social science, and saying that the social sciences are embedded in it. And on the other hand, the social sciences say, well, we do empirical work. We do our research. We prove our research. And so we're not just developing speculative ideas. We're going out and researching and come back with our empirical evidence that's verified. So that's the debate I'm intervening in. So I want to compare and contrast the different orientations that ground the concept of role, the sociological concept of role, and Arendt's concept of action, and seek to develop the different possibilities for understanding and for action and reflection in contemporary society. Both role and action concepts will be treated as ideal types. Thus, for the purpose of getting at the concepts of the grounds of the concept of role, the differences between the two will be artificially highlighted. So, I won't bore you with the long tradition of the history of reflexivity in modern society, but I'll talk about the narrative of the paper. The narrative of my paper will be on comparing the scientific orientation to the study of society with the interpretive orientation to the study of society. What I call knowledge by discovery, knowledge by interpretation. So I begin first with an epistemological debate. This epistemological debate is, how do you go about creating knowledge about the world? Knowledge is created. It's done. It's a human activity undertaken by inquirers, and these inquirers have certain assumptions about how you go about getting knowledge. There's a scientific paradigm called the knowledge by discovery paradigm, and an interpretive paradigm. The scientific paradigm is the one that's dominant is in the natural sciences and for the most part, in the social sciences. And it's sometimes taken to be the only route to knowledge creation, i.e. we create the facts. And the interpretive tends to be more dominant in the humanities. So, let me outline the two different paradigms. So, the discovery mode is the typical mode in the natural sciences and adopted by the social sciences. Littlejohn says it's so widespread that it's sometimes erroneously assumed to be the only appropriate route to knowledge and not just one possible avenue. The key assumptions are knowledge, the world lies outside the mind of the observer and awaits in discovery. There's a world out there, you often hear this, the real world out there, and it lies await of discovery. knowledge is something you get by observing. The standard of good knowledge in the discovery mode is accurate and objective observation. And so one of the key elements for the discovery mode is to develop the technologies for observation, whether it is the universe, initially the telescope, or the microscope. Developing technologies so you can do accurate observation. And the criteria is validity, i.e., is it this reliable and valid knowledge? Is it verifiable? Can somebody else come and come to the same conclusions? So that's one paradigm for knowledge creation in modern society. Let me use the concept of role as a way of highlighting this modern idea of paradigm. Role. What is the concept of role, sociologically speaking? Basically, role responds to a position in society called status. That people have statuses in society, and those statuses come with expectations. So let's take the example of student and teacher. There's the status of student and teacher, and there's the expectation, rights and obligations that go with each of these statuses. Role is the performance of those expectations. So the typical expectations that go to the set of expectations that go along with a student, for example, would be attend classes, do assignments, and get graded. The expectations of the professor would be to come in, give lectures, provide a curriculum and a syllabus, do the assessment fairly and objectively, etc. So they're supposedly the expectations on both parts, and this is how these roles interact. So a definition, a simple definition of role is a typified response to a typified expectation. And that these expectations are not the expectations of other people. If Professor Berkowitz is teaching a class, it's not Roger's expectations, but the expectations of being a professor and a teacher. So in a class recently, Roger asked, okay, I'm asking you a question, why are you answering? Are you answering freely, or is it driven by some biological need? Sociologists would say, well, that person, the student, is answering because that's part of the expectations of the teacher-student relation. You've had to read the material in advance. The teacher can ask a question. It's expected the student be able to answer. So that and sociologists can call this motivated compliance. So let's think about that. Role theory formulates actors who are able to recognize expectations and know how to respond to them. To be named as a parent or a teacher or an army colonel is to simultaneously invoke specific expectations with regard to behavior. And this is often called professionalism. In Peter Berger's analogy, he says, society provides the script and we have to perform it. The actor must not only know the part, you have to not only know your lines, you have to be able to get up and perform it on the stage of society. This concept is central to mainstream sociology. Now, the paradigm that rests on a different epistemological perspective is knowledge by interpretation. And here, the knowledge by interpretation makes very different assumptions about the nature of how knowledge is created. First of all, it says that the mind and the world are interdependent. And that, therefore, all knowledge requires a knower. And that knowledge emerges as a transaction between a knower and a known. which means all knowledge is colored by a perspective. So, from the knowledge by interpretation paradigm, accuracy is a limited focus on knowledge creation. It's a limited focus because the issue for the knowledge by interpretation perspective is the worth and the value of the perspective, i.e., what does it help us see and what is it blind to? So the question that knowledge by interpretation will ask, when we see a knowledge, we will ask a reflexive question. What perspective made it possible? Not just is it accurate, but what perspective made it possible? So, as playfully, and this is, I'm playing with a grey zone in Arendt, I think, here, because Arendt was very emphasized the importance of facts, as we know. This is the theme of this year's seminar and conference, and the how politics depends and democracy depends on facts and truth-telling. I'm going to place Arendt in the knowledge by interpretation paradigm. And see, what could a society look like from the knowledge by interpretation perspective? And what I'm going to do is take her version of the Greek polis. And the Greek polis is, as we know, the public realm that was distinct from the household. The household was about concerns of urgency, welfare, concerns of life, taking care of each other. The public realm was about excellence, about freedom, where people interacted with each other as equals. Now, in the public realm, she says, humans get to develop the capacity for beginning something new, for doing something unexpected, in such a way that they show their uniqueness and individuality. And she says, since action acts upon beings who are capable of their own action, reaction, apart from being a response, is always an action that strikes out on its own and affects others. She goes on to say that the smallest act in the most limited circumstances bears the seed of boundlessness, because one deed and sometimes one word suffices to change every constellation. So the condition of unpredictability and surprise are part of the actor she's theorizing in the polis. So we have two actors here, the person of action and the role player. They seem to have opposite skills. They're provided with opposite skills insofar as the person of action develops the capacity to begin something new and to respond to new beginnings, to respond to unexpected beginnings, where the role player responds to expectations, a typified response to a typified expectation. So we have the expected and the action as the unexpected. And this is where social science and Arendt diverge, significantly diverge. So, at first glance, Arendt's understanding of the person of action is the opposite of the structuralist role player. One way to understand this opposition between these two players is that each perspective describes two different worlds. The world of the ancient Greek polis, or the world of the modern social system. For the former, the ancient Greek polis, action is required as a full condition of membership. She says, quote, courage therefore became the political virtue par excellence, and only those men who possessed it could be admitted to a fellowship that was political in content and purpose, and therefore transcended the mere togetherness imposed by all through the urgencies of life. In contrast, for role, and if you're ever in a job or even in the university where we are, say, are you competent in your job? They'll ask, are you good at doing your job? And it'll be in terms of the expectations of those jobs. This is the way this concept in the 1950s was a way of studying society, has seeped into administrative language. It's sort of surrounded by administrative language and contributing to the administration of society. So, but the opposition between both concepts is complex. Because Arendt recognizes that the public realm has seriously been eroded in favor of what she calls the social realm. She says it's decisive, with the rise of society, the rise of the modern era, that society, on all its levels, excludes the possibility of action, which formerly was excluded from the household. Instead, society expects from each of its members a certain kind of behavior, imposing innumerable and various rules, all of which tend to normalize its members and to make them behave, to exclude spontaneous action or outstanding achievement. So, insofar as the social realm dominates, the picture given by the structuralist role theory of how humans behave in modern society is the same as Arendt's. Both perspectives see contemporary human action as best understood in terms of what society expects. The similarities between Arendt's formulation of behavior and the structuralist definition of role make sense only for Arendt because action has now been banished to the private realm. Now, one of the differences between Arendt and social scientists would be that Arendt's analysis of the organization of modern society includes an ethical and political evaluation. Like Foucault, she argues that the dangers of totalitarianism, dangers that she experienced as a German Jewish refugee, are tied to the wider tendencies of modernity and such, and therefore in the West are the locus of modernization. Arendt, again as with Foucault and others, sees the rise of modernity intertwined with the rise of the social sciences and with the rise of mass society. So she and structural role theorists may agree that behavior in modern society is governed by expectations and obligations. For Arendt, the grounds of such a description represent a mass society way of thinking. In describing the social sciences, she says, and I'm summarizing here from pages 43 to 45, quoting from pages 43 to 45 in The Human Condition. She says, the social phenomena which make the mathematical treatment of reality possible, great numbers, accounting for conformism, behaviorism, and automatism in human affairs, were precisely those traits which, in Greek self-understanding, distinguish the Persian civilization from their own. The unfortunate truth about behaviorism and the validity of its laws is that the more people there are, the more likely they are to behave, and the less likely they are to tolerate non-behavior. In reality, deeds will have less and less a chance to stem the tide of behavior, and events will lose more and more of their significance. Therefore, statistical uniformity is by no means a harmless scientific ideal. It is the no longer secret ideal of a society which, entirely submerged in the routine of everyday living, is at peace with the scientific outlook inherent in its existence. The rise of the behavioral sciences indicates clearly the final stage of this development, when mass society has devoured all strata of the nation and social behavior has become the standard for all regions of life. So this is a very sweeping and devastating critique of the social sciences. So she argues that with the rise of the social realm and the rise of the behavioral sciences are intertwined. By implication, therefore, and the social sciences say, well, our concept is testable and verifiable. If we look at, if I was to do a study of how BART students react, it would seem that they're, for the most part, looking at the concept of role, they're fulfilling the concept of role, they've been socialized successfully to be BART college students, and if not, they'll suffer sanctions of failing courses and ultimately being disciplined and expelled. And that could be documented. How can you document the idea of beginning something new? I mean, that's the challenge in terms of from a scientific framework. So, for Arendt, far from being a neutral, I mean, the social sciences claim objectivity, but far from being neutral, concepts like role may promote a potential blindness to the possibilities of action, a blindness that fits to the requirements of bureaucracy, the most modern form of government. As Walsh says, the failure to acknowledge the distinction between action and other kinds of human activity is for Arendt the cardinal and original sin of the social sciences. Arendt anticipates the analysis of Foucault, who argues that the human sciences in general have their roots in the rise of a disciplinary technology, prisons, insane asylums, etc. This is a quote from Foucault. These sciences, he says, which have so delighted our humanity for over a century, have their technical matrix in the petty, malicious minutiae of the disciplines and their investigations. Thus, the concept of role, despite its claim to be neutral and objective, when we look at the grounds behind that make the concept possible, we see that it is culturally and historically specific. And it promotes a certain relation to society that may be politically and ethically problematic. In what way might this be the case? My own teachers, Alan Blum and Peter McHugh, two American sociologists who began their collaboration in Columbia and spent most of their working collaboration in York University in Canada, took up this concern in their work. And they did it independently of Arendt, but at a certain point, Arendt was discovered by these sociologists, and then they were sort of seen to have similarities in the way that they saw themselves as sort of alone in the field of sociology. So they argue that the mainstream, this is back in 1984, before they came across Arendt's work, that the mainstream sociological understanding of education as socialization into the roles one is expected to play as a functioning child. So, successfully socialized to play roles of student, teacher, employee, part-time, daughter, son, husband, wife. They say that that conception is limited because it assumes that adequate socialization is one that enables the actor to satisfy expectations. Such an assumption is limited, they argue, because there is no place made in the socialization for deliberation on the quantity and quality of the expectation. What is the nature of the expectation? So I have a quote. A good upbringing, for example, cannot merely satisfy expectations because these expectations could be established by lunatics and idiots. In Arendt's later work of Eichmann in Jerusalem, she makes the same argument about the constant danger of the banality of evil in everyday life. Again, a quote from The Life of the Mind. By shielding people from the dangers of examination, it teaches people to hold fast to whatever is prescribed, whatever the prescribed conducts of rule are, may be at any given time in a society. What people then get used to is less the content of the rules than the possession of rules under which to subsume particulars. I am alluding, of course, to what happened in Nazi Germany and to some extent in Stalinist Russia. Peter Berger, cited earlier, regarding the concept of role, makes the same point when, in describing role separation, he notes that the Nazi concentration camp commander, who commits horrors during the day and writes sentimental letters to his children in the evening, is an extreme case of something that occurs in society all the time. In other words, does the concept of role, in the very precise way it is conceptualized by social science, allow for deliberation on the content of the expectations and to allow for the possibility of whether to assess if these expectations have been established by lunatics and idiots or criminals? So, to reiterate, the differences between the concept of role and Arendt's concept of action in terms of their understanding of the nature of contemporary society and the individual in that society are very deep. Structuralist role theory looks at the reality of modern society and sees positions which are relatively stable morphological components of social structure. A contemporary interpretive perspective, looking at the same object, sees a society organized on the basis of excluding action and on precluding the possibility, according to the scientific outlook, of seeing that exclusion. Arendt and structuralist role theory represent two different ways of viewing the world. They also offer different kinds of visions of different kinds of communities and different ways of life. It's more than just different descriptions. Rather, there's a theorizing and a theoretic work that grounds and makes possible the separate descriptions. So, the opposition between Hannah Arendt and role theory is not only the different capacities that each perspective privileges, the role player, the action person, or the orientations, the interest in the expected versus the unexpected, but implicitly the fundamentally different assumptions that structure their knowledge production. Arendt's classification of human activity in the human condition can now be understood as involving both an accepting of the sociological focus on everyday life and a highly critical perspective on how sociologists actually carry this out. So, both role theorists and Arendt says, yes, true, contemporary society expects from each of its members a certain kind of behavior. For role theory, this is a neutral description, while for Arendt, it is precisely what is dangerously problematic about contemporary society. While role theorists acting on the assumptions of knowledge by discovery often can and often do accuse Arendt's analysis of being subjective, dogmatic, opinionated, Arendt would argue that a role theory is sustained by the very society it purports to describe. While social scientists can justifiably argue that Arendt's perspective, by virtue of the freedom built into the concept, is not available to empirical verification, Arendt's builds into her analysis a reflexive understanding of why the behavioral sciences are verifiable in the first place. In particular, Arendt's analysis of contemporary society explicitly includes ethical and political evaluation. For example, I have a quote from Canavan here, "Our duty to be citizens, looking after the world and taking responsibility for what is done in our name," while the objectivity of role theory explicitly excludes such evaluations because we have to remain neutral and objective. And just let the facts speak for themselves. I mean, so one way I have of thinking about this recently is the evacuation of the Occupy Wall Street from Zuccotti Park, and Mayor Bloomberg speaking to the press afterwards saying, well, they have a right to protest, and the people have a right to go to work, and the other people have a right to go home, and some other people have a right to go shopping. He didn't use that phrase, but it's implied. And he said, you know, as long as everyone respects everyone's rights, we'll all get along. But he's putting the right to protest for a social system at the same level as the right to go home, the right to go to work, and the right to shop. And it's again, it would be the kind of orientation, which is respectful, that sees that the social system always has to work, always has to operate, be administered in a way that doesn't cause disruption, which is against the very idea of what action is about in the first place, and including the dangers of action. So it seems that the solution proposed by the empirical position at the beginning, that all ideas should be tested against the evidence, is now more problematic. If by such testing is meant empirical verification, then the danger of remaining blind to the ontological consequences of one's own knowledge creation remains. If epistemology means committed to only accepting as knowledge what has been empirically verified, then such an epistemology is in danger of not recognizing the possibility of action and of being unaware of its own lack of recognition. And as Socrates, that they don't know, and they don't know that they don't know. I know that sounded like, what's his name? Rumsfeld. So, one conclusion that we could arrive, that the first real conclusion of the paper is that through a reflexive analysis, we can see that the knowledge by discovery perspective paradigm is not an alter to the knowledge by interpretation, but rather a subset of it. It's an example of how a perspective colors an action. And though self-understanding is of its neutral description of the world and that it's providing accurate observation, that is one way of creating knowledge. Not an invalid way of creating knowledge, but it's one way of creating knowledge. So we see that the epistemology perspective of discovery not only colors, but structures the way social action is seen and understood, ironically calling a ground to its interpretive ground, which goes some way to deconstruct its self-understanding as an objective description. This interpretive ground, underlying discovery epistemology, shows that the paradigmatic difference between discovery and interpretation is deeply artificial. It's nevertheless useful for the purpose of clarification through radical interpretive analysis. So, in the narrative of the paper so far, Arendt's position would appear to be more reflexively coherent, but as she addressed in her later work, while our concept of action points to a fundamental human capacity to interrupt action, it does not by itself confront the ethical problematic of the content of expectations. And this is why Arendt's later work sort of took a bit of a turn, as I see it, and I'm happy to have an argument with people about this. Not happy to have an argument, but I'm willing to have an argument. Her position does make possible and assume a freedom of action that is a precondition for a resolution of this problematic. I'm asking the question, is a more reflexive relation to the idea of role possible for sociology? A relation that both allows sociologists to take responsibility for their knowledge production while addressing the limitations of a strict social science perspective. Is it possible, in other words, to use Arendt's criticisms as a useful tool that complements sociology rather than attempting to wreck it? If one way of characterizing Arendt's position is that it's more reflexively principled, then is a principled form of sociology possible? One, for example, that enables the sociologist to conceptually make room for the possibility of freedom in following expectations. So I'm going to draw on two sociologists. One is Berger, who was influenced by Sartre and Kant and Schutz, and introduced the concept of bad faith, Sartre's notion of bad faith, and then also Blum and McHugh and their concept of the need to make a distinction between rule following and acting on principle. So, one way to address this possibility is to return to this phenomenological sociologist, Peter Berger, who provides for the possibility of an actor who can be formulated as having the capacity to know and understand expectations, but also the capacity to resist them. In order to conceptualize actors in this way, he acknowledges that he has to move outside the scientific framework in order to draw on a more phenomenological framework. In this case, it conceptualizes actors who have the capacity to see that they have a choice with regard to their expectations that demand to be met in every social encounter. That's sort of what sociologists point out. In every social encounter you're in, you're faced with expectations. And those expectations are tied to the statuses of the various situations. But can sociology formulate an actor who's able to assess the expectation and accept their responsibility in meeting them? So, drawing on Kant, he acknowledges that this frame of reference requires an assumption of freedom that is not empirically available, given that there is no other way of perceiving freedom, either in oneself or through another human being, except through inner subjective certainty that dissolves as soon as it is attacked with the tools of scientific certainty or theoretical analysis. This means having some reserve on the orientation that believes only in the fragments of reality that can be dealt with scientifically, while still showing how it is possible to think sociologically without abandoning this notion of freedom. This is Peter Berger. The capacity to say yes or no to expectations is a universal possibility. is basically the assumption of law and assigning criminal responsibility, even if this possibility is not actualized in practice. Quote from Berger, "If we maintain that authenticity and freedom in society is possible, we are not thereby maintaining that most men are indeed making use of this possibility." While acknowledging the contribution that knowledge from a social science perspective makes to our understanding, especially with respect to how we are social beings and our existence is bound to specific social locations, the new frame further allows for the recognition that every role, this is a quote from Peter Berger, can be played knowingly or blindly. Insofar as it's played knowingly, it can become a vehicle for one's own decisions. From a frame of reference that recognizes man as free, he wrote in 1961. So, man, he uses that language. That man is free, like Arendt. Berger introduces the notion of bad faith, a frame of reference that conceptualizes actors as responsible for their actions. That is, actors are in bad faith when they attribute to iron necessity what they themselves are choosing to do. Thus, and this is a quote from Peter Berger, the terrorist who kills and excuses himself because the party ordered him to kill is in bad faith, because he pretends that his existence is necessarily linked with the party, while in fact this linkage is a consequence of his own choice. So here's a sociology that's separate. Say, okay, yes, you're faced with expectations, and you respond to the expectations, but you remember that there's always a choice, and you always have the possibility of saying no. It might mean you're going to have to go against sanctions. You might have to suffer sanctions, but you have that possibility. Berger argues that this more humanistic take is relevant for a, quote, morally sensitive sociologist who has concerns about the pedagogic usefulness of what one is teaching. In this sense, he would say the value of sociology is justified by the belief that it's better to be conscious or reflexive about the possibilities in society than unthoughtful, unconscious, and that consciousness or reflexivity is a condition of our freedom. In other words, with the help of both Kant's critique and Schutz's phenomenology, Berger provides one way sociologists can be reflexively responsible in this age of reflexive modernity. This solution calls on sociologists to be able to move outside of the social science perspective and view the world from an existential framework, which he argues makes for a fuller view of social reality. In the example, I'm going to use the example of Eichmann throughout this. Berger's social science approach would allow sociologists to understand how Eichmann's actions were possible given the social world he operated within, while his phenomenological existentialism would and could condemn Eichmann's actions for his bad faith in claiming, and this is a quote from Arendt, he did his duty as he's told police in the court over and over again. And though it can be claimed that the concept of role explains Eichmann's actions very well, and Arendt reminds us that he rarely took an initiative outside of what was expected, Berger's reflexive move allows sociology to say more than that Eichmann was a competent role player. While this reflexive move is an advance in that it conceptualizes actors with the capacity to take responsibility for their performance, and so also sociologists with an ability to take responsibility for their conceptualizations, we still don't have an actor with the capacity to dwell on the expectations. All we have is an actor who can say, no, I'm not going to do that, or yes, I am going to do this. I recognize I'm doing it. For example, and this is a quote from Arendt, in his last statement to the court, Eichmann admitted that he could have backed out of his role on one pretext and another, but that he had always thought such a step was inadmissible, and even now, he did not think it was admirable. This is at the end of the trial. He could have backed out of the horrific crimes he was part of, but he didn't think it was admirable vis-a-vis his conception of duty. That is, he recognized he had a choice to say yes or no, but such an action was not taken because even in the retrospect of the horror of his crimes, it was not, quote, in his words, admirable. With this example, the case could be made that Eichmann is acting in good faith in acknowledging that he chose to do what he thought of as his duty. and this despite the awareness of the horrific consequences of his action. Thus, acknowledging that one has a choice, while necessary, is not yet sufficient to address the ethical issue of deciding whether the obligations should be undertaken. So the freedom is just the first condition. So this is where I go on to Alan Blow and Peter McHugh, whose work is concerned with the problem of how and why to theorize whether an action should be undertaken at all. And they take sociology in a more radical direction. Self-reflection, they say, is speech that orients to its center, quote, to its origin or principle, as speech that orients to the way it centers itself. This, they say, is a condition for the very existence and practice of the human sciences. In developing their conceptualization of self-reflection, they seek to develop the concept of an actor who can be conceived of as principled. When such an actor is endowed with the potential to theorize the auspices of his commitments to the action, i.e., that you're theorizing an actor who has the capacity to theorize their own commitments. Why am I committed to the principle behind this action? Not to what's expected of me, but to the principle it embodies. So such an actor would not only have developed the capacity to understand and respond to expectations, be a competent role player, but also have the capacity to theorize the deep difference between doing what is expected and doing what is right, the distinction between being principled and being rule-guided. The oriented actor who lives by principle, this is a quote from them, they argue, identifies the need to be oriented as the need to theorize undertaking, so as the need to orient to whether the particular convention needs to be done, regardless of how it is done and how to do it well. Do we need to do it at all? That fundamental question is part of what they would say is would be part of the actor who is self-reflective and part of the theorist who is self-reflective. Can you ask that question? Is that action, does it need to be undertaken? Stanley Riffel, one of Blum and McHugh's first students from their Columbia days, described the orientation of Blum and McHugh, and he says, what can be said of the competent role player? It can be said that they are doing well whatever the rules require. They are then competent at going along with expectations. But can we not say that if this is the actor's limits, even as the actor must be aware of the rules, there is a glaring unconsciousness, an self-reflectiveness in stopping there? I would suggest that something akin to making one's own behavior an object for themselves for such an actor would require thinking not just about how to do it well, but orienting to whether it should be done at all, whether it is right to do it in the first place. In this case, the concept of role can be reformulated to include the possibility of reflecting on whether one should undertake the action that the expectations call for. Since this is precisely the kind of thinking that Arendt said Eichmann lacked, the theorist now has the possibility of assessing any particular performance, not on the basis of whether it was competent, but also on the basis of whether it should have been undertaken in the first place. One of Arendt's main points in her famous study was not that Eichmann was an exception, but that he was normal. This is a quote. As Eichmann told her, the most potent factor in the soothing of his own conscience was the simple fact that he could see no one at all, who was actually against the final solution. And while people like Pastor Groover came to him and sought the alleviation of suffering, no one, he said, objected to the very performance of my duties as such. While the different expectations could be met were discussed, Eichmann claimed he was rarely confronted by the principle underlying the performance. Thus, as Arendt's controversial argument states, it was not just Arendt's banality in itself that allowed, pardon?
Eichmann's banality.
Sorry, Eichmann's banality. I'm tripping over myself. It was not just Eichmann's banality in itself that allowed the horrific evil of the Holocaust to be effectively organized, but, quote, the moral collapse the Nazis caused in respectable European society, not only in Germany, but in almost all countries, not only among the persecutors, but also the victims. While this existential case led Arendt to explore the relation between thinking and morality in her later work, Blum and McHugh address another aspect that is more germane to the interests of this paper, the reflexive responsibility of the social inquirer. The argument Blum and McHugh make is, if convention, rules, expectations were the limit. There could just be two basic orders. Somebody either does it or doesn't do it. They deviate or they conform. They, on the other hand, that the theorist needs to be conceived as a principled actor, which means treating practice and usage as if it were a principled text that is being interested in being responsive to that question, which reflectively becomes the way social inquirer have of exemplifying a responsiveness to the question of principle or rightness. That is to say, the reflexive sociologist committed to the study of roles to say is raising as intrinsic to that very question the principle of rightness of the action which the role performs, whether this involves being a parent, a teacher, or a soldier, or a student. Reflexive sociology, therefore, does not just limit itself to questions about the forces contributing to the performance of the role, which is what social science does and does well, nor to the possibility of recognizing one's choice to say yes or no to expectations, which is what Berger raises, but also the question of the principle or rightness of the undertaking. As Raffel says, theorizing rightness rather than expectedness of any contemplated action would be the self-reflective way for the actor to orient to rules. So, with this background, sociologists can now contribute to the very difficult and controversial dilemma of assessing or evaluating actions that raise concerns like that of the banality of evil. For example, in Arendt's review of the Nazi process of making Europe Judenrein, she reports on the ways it was executed in many different European countries and protectorates. Denmark presented a special case, she says, because, quote, only the Danes dared to speak out on the subject to their German masters. In this case, quote, the Nazis had met with resistance based on principle, and their toughness had melted like butter in the sun. She sees the Dane as acting from, quote, a comprehension of the requirements and responsibilities of citizenship and independence. The Danes provide an example of a political people whose actions can be understood on the basis of the distinction between rules and principles. In this case, the rules called for an obedience to the law. The Nazis never acted without first passing a law. But the Danes saw that such rule, even if backed by force, needed to be called into question on the basis of principle. In this case, the principle that innocent fellow citizens should not be killed, even under wartime conditions. The Danish situation was a case where the duty to be law-abiding and obedient was called into question on the principle that killing innocent people is wrong, even if legal. And while it would be informative to apply a social science concept of role to show how the Danes were perhaps responding to expectations built into Danish culture, as this concept could be applied to Vichy France, Romania, such an application would be able to make the distinction between rules and principles. And thus would not be in a strong position to evaluate the differences of the responses. In other words, social sciences and could be very good to talk about how the culture shaped people in a particular way. It would be very informative to act in a certain way. And that shows how people are shaped by larger social forces to act in a certain way. But it does not, and that is informative, but there's still the need to make that distinction between rules and principles. Because then it just reduces everyone to acting out their culture. Blum and McHugh say that this approach to inquiry runs the risk, and this is a quote, of humiliation, of having the commitment to theorizing undertaking, i.e. theorizing why it should be done in the first place, as if it is a sign of a dogmatic, opinionated, capricious, and subjective character. They argue that's the risk of this kind of inquiry, that it will run the charge of being subjective, in this modern era, of being subjective, opinionated, capricious. It's ironic, because the controversy surrounding Arendt's famous study of Eichmann is an instance of this risk of undertaking a reflexively principled inquiry, given that she was variously accused of every possible posture, extending from Jewish self-hatred to anti-Zionism, from insensitivity to tastelessness, and of course to arrogance. That's a quote from Ben Hadid. So, in an article on Arendt's reflection on evil, Richard Bernstein states, the primary lesson of the banality of evil, one does not have to be a monster, a sadist, or a vicious person to commit horrendously evil deeds. Evil can be an ordinary banal action. Bernstein goes on to say that the bureaucratic and technological conditions of modernity make the phenomenon more likely and dangerous. Bureaucracy, which requires people to see themselves as rule followers. And, you know, we think of bureaucracy in, okay, that's like being in the civil service or public service, but bureaucracy is throughout the administration of every organization, public and private, insofar as it has rules, it has, you know, when you sign up with your employer, or informally with being a student, there's the expectations you have to follow. And that's part of how bureaucracy works in modern society. Technology puts us at a distance between the initiator of the action and those who experience the action. And this makes everyday evil actions more likely. Bernstein goes on to say that Arendt wants us to confront honestly the paradox that even though normal persons may commit horrendous deeds without deliberate intention, they are nevertheless fully responsible for the deeds and must be held accountable. In this era of reflexive modernity, the same case can be made for the production of knowledge by sociologists. Berger provides for a reflexive orientation that enables the sociologists to hold the member accountable for the roles they follow by calling attention to the existential choices that actors make in each social situation, providing the criteria to judge whether they're in bad faith or not. I.e., the person who says, sorry, I have no choice. Which, anytime they've got a parking ticket, right? You've heard that. Sorry, I have no choice. Brown and McHugh go further by calling on the sociologists to make the distinction between rules and principles, and thus subject to inquiry the actual content of the rules or expectations being followed. So, the argument of this paper is that reflexive sociology, initiated by the phenomenological traditions, can escape the charges from theorists like Arendt and Foucault that the modern sciences are unreflectively tied to the society they describe. While role theory, as typically conceptualized in the social science tradition, is not neutral, but brings with it ethical and political implications, the reflexive orientation of radical interpretive sociology provides ways to examine these implications in their own right. Berger's phenomenological sociology calls attention to the possibility of saying yes and no to expectations, and Blum and McHugh provide the orientation that calls for the significance of questioning the principle underlying a performance. This means that making the reflexive articulation of the epistemological and ontological issues embedded in one's use of concepts and perspectives as much a part of practical research as the case being researched. This means that for this kind of sociology, you have to be prepared not only to engage in case studies, empirical work, etc., but to address some epistemological and ontological issues that are part of how it's placed in the wider culture. And it means being prepared to go between universal issues, large issues, and particular issues. So that's the thrust of this paper. I hope I haven't, my watch broke, so I think I'm okay. So I have areas for implications for Arendt in the way that but we could take up in questions in terms of her more Kantian focus. And I would see the Blum and McHugh focus as a more Socratic focus. And that's one tension that another tension, the argument of this paper follows the Socratic tradition, that the life of examination doesn't have to end in aporias and where everything is always called into question. It does raise that question of how